Hello and welcome to Accelerating AI Ethics, the podcast of the Institute for Ethics in AI at the University of Oxford. I'm Caroline Green, and I'm joined today by two very special guests, and I am in Nairobi with you. So my guests are Dr. Joy Bulawini and Angela Luganti. Joy Bulawini, you are a fellow of the Accelerator Fellowship Program at the Institute for Ethics in AI, and you're the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. Your research features in the award-winning documentary The Coded Bias, and that's why we're also in Nairobi today, and maybe you'll tell us a bit more about that. Angela Oduor Luganti, Executive Director at Ushahidi. You're a technologist, a community builder, an open source advocate, passionate about developing and using technology tools that positively impact marginalized communities. So welcome, and I'm so thrilled to be here with the both of you. So in the next hour or so, half an hour or so, we will be exploring, first of all, your work, how you're working together, but also African AI. And I'm really excited to learn from the both of you. So I would like to dive in with first few questions. I would like to get to know you better. Dr. Joy, tell us a little bit about your background. What brought you here? What brought you into working in technology? And how does your work relate to AI ethics?
Mm. So I think we have to start at the beginning. I'm the daughter of an artist and a scientist, and both sensibilities shape my work, hence why I go by poet of code. And the work of the Algorithmic Justice League actually started through an art project. I was in grad school and I was working on an art installation that used face detection software. Long story short, the face detection software didn't detect my dark skinned face, but it did detect the white mask I happened to have in my office, and that led to all kinds of questions. Was this just my face? Maybe my skin color? Or was this a bigger pattern? And when we started doing the research that ended up becoming the foundation of the Algorithmic Justice League, we did see that there was a wider pattern, right? So we were looking at AI to be the technology of the future, but we found it was taking us to the discrimination of the past while robbing us of our humanity in the present. So think of an ism, it was being embedded and continues to be embedded in AI systems. And so that's where that ethics piece comes in, where we're really asking what types of technologies do we want to be creating in society and who gets to decide?
So your work is very much featured in the Netflix documentary, The Coded Bias.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that, and specifically the world tour that you have, are undertaking.
Yes.
What's behind that?
Yes, so I never set out to be part of a documentary. I got direct messages, DMs from a filmmaker, film director, Shawnee Cantagna. So she reached out on Facebook. I didn't respond. She reached out on LinkedIn. I didn't respond. She somehow got multiple emails of mine. I'm like, oh, wow, this lady is persistent. Okay. So I finally responded, and it turned out we had both been part of Fulbright program, and she came down to MIT and she told me how she'd like to interview me, and she was doing some documentary maybe about racist robots. I was like, "You're gonna have to work on the name?" But, okay, why not? So we didn't know that would start a 2-year journey, right? That would then eventually become the documentary Coded Bias, which premiered at Sundance and then was picked up by Netflix. So it was on Netflix, from 2021 to just April of this year, and this is in part where the tour came in. Because even though it's no longer distributed on Netflix, the conversation still needed to continue, and so a way to continue it without necessarily being reliant on any one distributor, right, was to have a world tour and bring that conversation to different parts of the world.
Yeah, and it's wonderful just to see. So I've been present at two of your screenings, one in Oxford earlier this year in July 25, and then today now in Nairobi. And it's just incredible to see what it does to people, watching the documentary first and then having discussion afterwards with local experts. So it's really wonderful to be here.
Yeah.
Angela, tell me about your background. What brought you to technology? What do you do? And how does it link to AI ethics?
Okay, so just like Joy, I'll probably go all the way back to the beginning. I'm the child of two engineers. So from a very young age, I always knew that I wanted to do something similar to what my parents did. And then I really love math. So programming just kind of made sense. Um, and then right when I was in my third year of university, I got plugged into the Kenyan tech ecosystem. So it was when Nairobi's premier innovation hub, which is called the iHub, was coming up. I volunteered and I got to meet a bunch of other technologists who were not just using, like, building tools for the sake of building them, but finding ways of plugging them to solve problems in our communities. And I think that's kind of what sparked what is now my over more than a decade career focused on building technology tools to impact the lives of people who tend to get left out of different conversations. So my work at Ushahidi has been focused on building open source technology tools that will help people everywhere to quickly gather data and then use that data from people's lived experiences to drive change in their communities, whether that's responding to different crises, whether that is creating awareness about human rights violations, or ensuring that the voices of people who are directly affected by climate change are actually getting heard. Now, how does that kind of plug into the AI conversation? There's a very, watching Coded Bias, there's a phrase that Dr. Joy used, that data is destiny, right? And our work has been focused on bringing up people's lived experiences. So we have a ton of data, or rather, the focus of the work has been really gathering community voices and using that to drive change. And the process of drawing out insights from that has been a largely manual one. So, you'll have to recruit tons of volunteers to process the data, properly categorize it, translate it, geolocate it so that it can actually be meaningful. And so we started to have conversations internally around, how do we move from data into insight faster? It was like, okay, we can leverage AI to actually help us tell those stories in a better way. But then when you look at the communities that we are serving, primarily in the global south, trying to use AI systems that exist today, it just exposed everything that you experienced while you were at MIT and that you talked about in the documentary. There are languages that are not represented, so it's not quite easy to then leverage the tools in the right way. There are such gaps in terms of contextualization, and that's what then drove me into figuring out, how do we deal with this larger ecosystem problem so that we can then help these local communities tell better stories.
That's wonderful. And we're going to hear more about, some of those potentials, but also challenges a little bit later on. First of all, I'd like to hear more about the two of you and how you know each other, how you work together.
Yeah. You should
I mean,
start. You
you want
should.
me to start?
Yes, I
Okay.
do.
So first,
You're a country.
I mean, I've always been a huge fangirl of Dr. Joy. So we got to meet for the first time in person this year in Davos, which is the World Economic Forum's annual meeting that's hosted at the beginning of every year. We happen to be World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders. I'm in the 2024 cohort. Are you in 2023?
I think I'm 2022. They claimed me somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. So we are part of the a select few global leaders who are invited into this gathering. And there was like a natural fit just because we care about the same stuff. We happen to have the same friends as well, just from different corners. So you've gone to Oxford with a bunch of people from my Oxford class, sorry, my YGL class. You collaborated with a bunch of researchers as well. And that was the beginning of this, essentially, because we got talking not just about the work itself, but like personal challenges within leadership as well. What does it look like to be, a
Young global leaders.
young global leader, African women leading organizations? What are the challenges around being so forward about this work? How do you deal with, managing your team?
The threats from inside, the threats from outside.
So yeah, just really commiserating with each other around those challenges as women in the technology industry, as people who are advocating for inclusiveness. And then she said she was coming to Nairobi. I'm like, I have to host you. We have to make this happen. So that's how we're here.
Absolutely. We also, had the pleasure of having dinner together the first night, which was great. So I was thinking, "This can't be the last time we share a meal." Mm-mm.
So many more meals.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up on that point you just said around women leadership in technology. I mean, that by itself is already something that we need a lot more of, right? How do you see the future here? How can we engage women more? How can we get our girls on board? I've got two daughters. I got to meet your wonderful daughters somewhere here. How do we do that?
I do think role models are essential, and I've seen that with the response to coded bias. When you watch the film, you see leading experts in computer science talking about AI, talking about AI harms, who happen to be women. We got one man in there because, we're trying to be gender inclusive in our work. It's hard. It's hard, but we do our best. And so when even, before we went to Oxford, England, we were in Oxford, Mississippi, and I went to elementary school there, so we visited Bramlett Elementary School, and I remember looking at the kindergartners and the first graders we were looking at, right? And the boys and the girls equally as excited and thrilled to share what they were learning about computer science. They were learning already how to code as early as kindergarten and first grade. And then, as we get older and older, we're told people do this work and not that work. We start getting into the different boxes and the different silos, whether it's gender or even discipline, right? So for me to be a poet of code, right, or to use that storytelling element, which some might describe as a more feminine approach to dealing with some of these issues, I think it's important that people can see many examples of what it looks like to be a woman, what many examples of what it looks like to be a leader as well. And I think the stories we celebrate are just as important. So who we put on the front of magazines. When I was on the cover of Fast Company, it was actually sad to hear how few women technologists are ever featured, right, in those sorts of spaces. When I was in Vogue, it was important for me to be represented looking a little geeky and that they knew that I did something around algorithmic justice. So I think there are many spaces we can be in where we're saying it doesn't just have to be one mold, but I think more important than that is that you belong and your voice matters. So even if no one has looked like you or no one has done it the way you're doing it, you're welcomed here. And I think that's up to us, right, to demonstrate it in how we show up in our own leadership and the risk we take, and also being honest about the challenges of it. What it means to be a young global leader when we're talking about these spaces where we're one of few or one of one. I think it's important that we acknowledge those parts too.
Mhm. Absolutely. And Angela, how do you feel, now specifically in Kenya, are there women leaders in technology? I mean, obviously you are one of them, but do you see particular challenges here in this country?
So it's interesting because one of the things that I didn't mention as I was talking about my history is I co-founded an organization called the Care Chicks with a bunch of friends in the very early days that was focused on this particular problem. How do we get more women in the technology industry, right? And I think the tagline that we came up with was, wanting to create a community of women who build, a community of women who serve, and a community of women who then lead. So building service and leadership. And to begin with, it was okay, let's start by actually building that capacity. So, training them and starting from a very young age, like with girls like my daughters, how do they, because that's where those seeds get planted. Like I said, I knew that I want to take on a career in engineering from a very early age. And that was a factor of who I was surrounded by. My mom is probably that very first, you know, figure that I kind of looked up to. So how do we create more of that? And it started off by creating clubs in schools where you'd have women come in and talk to these children and get them to understand that, hey, there are more people who will look like you who are in the space, and then running coding camps. So they're actually getting some of that technical skills, or running a training program where you bring in women from low income areas and then taking them through a 1 year intensive course and then making sure that you plug them into jobs after that. And I think we have seen a significant increase in the number of women within the tech ecosystem who are actually building. So I remember when people would come into Nairobi to the iHub to kind of take the tours to see what the tech ecosystem looked like. The one remark they'd always make is like, "Wow, there's so many women in the room." We're like, "Yes, that's amazing." And now the next frontier is, okay, we need more women in leadership positions. So now the challenge has moved from, okay, yes, we're covering the bases on, we're training them, we're mentoring them, but how do we break through that barrier where they can actually stay within leadership? And you start to deal with things around, let's see, so there's what do we call imposter syndrome, right? How are we getting people to understand, well, women to feel more comfortable within those leadership positions? How are we creating a conducive environment as well? We don't talk enough about the challenges that it takes to lead these organizations, not only from a professional perspective, but a personal one. So we're also talking about what are the strategies we are taking to kind of retain them, and what are those ceilings that we need to break. So I think there's still more work that needs to be done on that frontier, right? We bonded a whole lot on some of the challenges as young women leading technology organizations, whether it's in terms of getting access to funding, looking the way we look like, right, and being women. So what are we doing to try and now break down those barriers so that we can actually have more women remaining in those leadership positions?
Absolutely. It is a complex issue, being a woman in leadership.
Whole other podcast. Here we're accelerating at speed.
Could be here the whole day.
Yeah, more.
So, what I really want to, so one of the kind of common factors that I see in both of your work is how you go about lifting people's voices. You start from a grassroots perspective, and so it's very localized and contextualized how you do your work. So you've already just introduced that, what you do. You work with the local communities. In the coded bias, we also, see an example of that, where it's a particular community. Maybe you can tell us more a little bit about that and why it is so important.
Yes, so in the film Coded Bias, we are introduced to the Brooklyn tenants and we follow their journey a bit. And I write about unmasking AI, where there was a moment for me as a graduate student where I felt really disconnected. The work that I was doing, publishing, in the research area, I'm in academia, but the issue we're talking about extends so far beyond the ivory tower. So I'm thinking, okay, something's not connecting. Do I even want to stay in academia? And right as I was grappling with those questions inside myself, I got an email from a group that actually works with tenants. And they were saying, "We want you to write an amicus brief." I was like, "That sounds cool. What's an amicus brief? What are we doing here?" Right? And it turned out that they were actually looking for people with expertise on computer vision and artificial intelligence because they had a group of tenants who wanted to protest the installation of a facial recognition system as the way to enter their homes. And so in working with them, it finally made me see the impact of the work beyond the institution. And I remember when I went to visit them, right, how excited they were that I was there and how excited I was to learn what they were already doing. They were organizing amongst themselves, and I'd spent a lot of time as a grad student, not just writing papers, but I would make explainer videos and websites and all of these things that you're not really incentivized to do, making your research legible beyond the people who need to sign off or who might review it. There are no style points. There's no extra credit for that. But I thought it was important because, again, I saw myself as speaking to more than academics, more than researchers. So to hear from them that, oh, we went to your website and we could show the older people in our office and in our building what we were talking about, and it made it make sense. And that for me, I said, "Oh, that's why I'm doing this work. I'm not just gathering empirical evidence so that I can publish another paper and get a citation credit. We're creating this so we have actionable research that people can actually use on the front lines in their advocacy, and seeing how the gender shades research traveled was really eye-opening for me to say that, okay, there's another way to approach this work, and it's meaningful not because an academic institution puts a stamp on it, but because individuals on the front lines take it up.
Absolutely. I feel, working in AI ethics at an academic institution, I do feel that there is more of a movement now towards, really engaging with communities rather than silos of experts. Where does the expertise come from? So, and I'd love to hear more about, the tools you are building and to really, shape what responsible AI looks like. Can you tell us a specific example of one of those tools?
Right. So we've Ushahidi, the flagship platform that we built is actually named after the organization. It's called the Ushahidi platform. It's what's been used over the last 17 years to crowdsource data from different communities around different issues. So it's been used in more than 160 countries, more than 200,000 times. Whether it's responding to crises, whether it is again documenting human rights violations, uh, protecting our democracies, or focusing on climate justice. So I'm going to give you an example of how it's been used generally, or at least one of my favorite examples around how it was used to raise the voices of marginalized communities, and then feed that into how we're looking at building a responsible AI ecosystem based on some of that work. So in 2020, this was at the peak of the COVID-19 crisis, I think, in mid March. So Spain was in lockdown, right? And, we all know what was going on during that period. And so many people were stuck in their homes during the lockdown without access to different resources. So there was a group of technologists and different communities that came together and decided to figure out how they could connect people who needed support with those who could give. So this is a long way of saying coordinating mutual aid efforts, right? So I could go in and say, I'm in Nairobi, in Kilimani area, and I'm available to go buy groceries, or I'm available to go and buy medicine for person X. Meanwhile, somebody else in the area will say, hey, I'm someone who's immunocompromised. I cannot leave. I need these resources. I either need groceries or I need this type of medication. And they could then go ahead and connect them. I believe they managed to distribute more than 20,000 masks and actually guide the Spanish government's response efforts during that time.
Okay.
But that's not even the beautiful thing for me, was the fact that they not only did that for the Spanish community, but they documented the entire model around how they perform that mutual aid effort. So whether it is the technical documentation on how you set up the platform, they translated the documentation into Spanish. And by the time we were getting to June of 2020, there were 22 other frena la curva. So frena la curva is Spanish for flatten the curve. There were 22 different maps in 22 other Spanish-speaking countries that were now doing the same thing, right? So again, this is such a beautiful example of this bottom-up approach of really figuring out like what is the need, what is a challenge, and then seeing how that then feeds into response. And so we have over 200,000 examples of that, whether that is communities in Kenya trying to map out where there's mapping out the fuel shortage, or documenting what's going on during the elections, or trying to understand what people's perceptions are to climate response in Tana River County. Right. So when you now go into this conversation around responsible AI, we've been doing work to surface community generated data and people's lived experiences for more than 17 years. Right. We've been raising the voices of these communities for that long. Right. What could that mean for creating some sort of representation around their voices, around their lived experiences as we continue to build these models, right? So that's where our strand of thinking is going into. How do we leverage the 17 years worth of collective intelligence, like really rich intelligence, to create some sort of representation? And on a second strand, how do we also use that knowledge to then build models of our own that will then help to quickly classify, categorize data based on their lived experiences, so that we're not just leveraging models that have been built from outside without their lived experience trained into it, but really feeding into that to then make sure that it's a continuous process. So that's what we're doing. Of course, there's questions around how do we then handle data sovereignty? How do we handle people's rights in terms of them determining how their data is getting used? And those are all conversations that we are looking forward to getting into.
Mhm. And we're looking forward to supporting these conversations in the future, because you will be joining us at the Institute of Biometric and AI as an accelerator fellow. So, and a collaboration with the Shahidi. So that would be really great. So following on from that, what strikes me also being here, so Africa is often still perceived as, you know, uh, receiving the receiver and the receiving end of AI rather than actually building AI.
Yeah.
Is there something that's still true? And how do you, see how can we change that perception?
Yes and no, in the sense that I think from the people who are building, the perception of the African content being a receiver is still very strong. But even from like the conversation we had today, there's an awakening amongst those of us who live on the continent around the fact that if we're going to actually leverage these tools to impact our own lives, and we have to be at the forefront of building. We're still in the nascent and early stages. There's still a lot that needs to be done, because for us to truly manage to build, there's a lot of different challenges that we need to deal with, whether it's on the talent front, really getting a significant mass of people who are domiciled here, who can actually build AI systems, whether it's getting access to computing resources that will actually allow us to leverage and build these tools. And then make sure that we also have data that we can use to really train these models that we want to build in the right way. And most importantly, make sure that we have a policy environment that is conducive for us to do that. So I yes, there's still a perception around us being consumers, and there are very real blockers around that. But there's a lot more of us who are trying to think through how do we break through those barriers? How do we make more data available? You're seeing the work that's being done by the folks working in the natural language processing space to work on low resource languages and make those accessible. There's a consortium or a collective of people who are also trying to figure out how to get computing resources available to the local communities. And I know that there's a lot of programs, a lot of universities that are trying to figure out how to also plug in machine learning, data science, and more of those. So we actually are creating a pipeline of people who we build rather than consume tools that are built without our lived contexts factored into them.
So this point of data, just how important it is. Earlier, you touched on some of the challenges around language, and there's that richness of language across African countries, but also in terms of making it fair, and how data is collected, how people consent to it,
Yeah.
and so on. Could you talk a little bit more about the particular challenges you see
Mm.
from both of your perspectives?
I think it's interesting in that we're doing, Coded Bias, the world tour. And across the world, data is a challenge, right? And often what we've seen is if data is available, data is there for the taking. And we see that across contexts when it comes to AI. So some of the litigation with some of the biggest players come around notions of, some would say contested data, some might say stolen data. Either way, it's fishy data, right? And so right, and so I think it's really interesting when we're talking about artificial intelligence and we're looking at data, that we look at data pipelines. So if we wanna look at ethical AI pipelines, I've been thinking about supply chains lately. So just like we've had blood diamonds, in some ways we have blood AI as well. So who was sacrificed on the way, to build this particular language model that's now powering a commercial product and so forth. We're in Kenya when you think about the content moderators, right, who have had traumatic experiences, who are not even really paid well, to go through some of the dirtiest data that's traumatic as well and what that impact is. And so even when I think about the biggest AI systems and so forth, just like when we look at supply chains, it's covering the world, right? So even though you might position certain regions as being consumers of AI, they're actually generating, right? They are the core source. And so just like we saw the exploitation of specific bodies from specific spaces, we're seeing that exploitation of digital bodies, right, as well. And that then fuels economic output elsewhere. So when I think about what is fair in data, I really think about this entire pipeline when we're thinking about the development of these systems and the deployment of these systems. But I also think redress is important. 'Cause after we've deployed these systems and harms have happened, too often is we come in, we experimented, we did the pilot, we left the mess, it's still a mess, right? And maybe you say sorry, but is there active work done to correct what was wrong in the first place? So I think accountability has to also include redress, and there's a lot of redressing to do when it comes to data exploitation.
The new kind of trauma that
Mm. Yeah,
we need to
algorithmic
stop.
traumas. In fact, at the Algorithmic Justice League, we have a platform, it's a harms reporting platform, and I don't think we've ever had harms analysts really last more like, a year's about the amount because you're literally reading through terrible things. And so we've had to kind of rethink what's the best approach to having people even engage with this sort of data. And so there is this sort of AI trauma, algorithmic trauma on multiple sides. The people who've been harmed by AI systems, sometimes they know, sometimes they don't know, sometimes they realize after the story's been retold where they understand, oh, I didn't really even have a real choice here. So there's that part that people we call the X-coded, right? Condemned, convicted, exploited, otherwise harmed by AI systems. And then there are the people who want to help and are going through it, but they themselves also need resources and support. So it's something we're still figuring out.
So I'm wondering about good examples. Do you know of a company, an AI system or so, maybe a local one, where
Yeah, give us some hope now that I
yeah,
dragged
some
us
hope.
dragged us into blood AI.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I will say this. There's been a lot of collective action to deal with the extractive nature of the AI ecosystem. So, you've heard about things like the Noodle license, which is the Nulite Border Open Data License, which was born to ensure that um, people who are doing work to document local languages, at least increase that level of representation, were not getting exploited, right? So the if you think about it this way, you come into a local community, you digitize their language, it goes in, it's used to, you know, build a proprietary model and then, charged back under an open data license. Um, that is exactly the challenge that we're talking about, right? And this license comes in and really gives agency back to those local communities to determine how that language data will get used and what type of I don't want to call it a reward, but is it remuneration? But what do they get back? What value do they get back out of actually putting in that work? So that it's not just take and then go somewhere else. So things like that give me hope. There's a lot of work being done by collectives like the Masahane Foundation to ensure that we actually have many African languages documented, and they now have a language hub that's continuing to fund work around creating positive use cases based on that. We have Lelapa AI that's also trying to do the same thing from a startup perspective. So um, through all of that work being done by all these groups that have been, really advocating for building African AI that is responsible and ethical, I will say that I think there's a lot more recognition of that from some of the big tech companies. And I say that with a lot of caution in the sense that I see them seeing the work. I see them trying to put in more resources into work that's being done by some of these organizations in a way that's not them pushing the agenda, but recognizing that you're doing good work and we are,
Mm,
we want to do the right thing. But I want to see how that actually pans out as the work continues.
mm,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but thank you for giving us some of those hopeful examples.
There's some hope. There's still a lot of work. There's a lot of fighting that's being done.
Yeah.
And it can get tiring, but there's progress. So we acknowledge the progress wherever it is.
Celebrate the wins. The
And so let's have a little look into Kenya and what's happening here with the AI strategy it has launched. What do you think about this strategy? And do you think that, it can really influence the rest of the continent and also globally?
Yes. One, I'm really pleased just because I also know the minds behind that strategy. And these are people who have been in the trenches with us advocating, like building and doing the research for years and years on end, and trying to ensure that whatever policies are being developed are grounded in the lived realities of the communities that we want to serve and are focused on creating a conducive environment. So that for me is a really excellent example of what it looks like to have collaboration with industry, academia, as well as policymakers to come up with something that is truly reflective of what is required. In as far as whether it will influence other parts of the African continent, I think so, just because Kenya and, places like Kenya, Nigeria have always been leaders in the space. Nigeria also have their own national AI strategy. Um, but I will say that one of the things I've been thinking about is what it would look like for Africa to work together. So we keep talking about collective action. What would it look like if the African continent came and did things together? And I know that we have the AU Continental Framework. So what would it look like to have something that's coming in from that perspective, then feeding into how we develop our national strategies? And the reason I say that is because when you look at the way the, the race for global dominance is moving, the European Union is working as a bloc. You have the United States working as a bloc. But here we are working individually as opposed to together, right? So for me, I want to see more of that. And I guess it is more of a challenge while acknowledging all the work that the African Union is doing, for them provide a lot more leadership because they have the capacity to bring more of these member states together to say, this is what would be good for the African continent. And this is how you then pick out different pieces and use that to drive your national strategies. So that it's not each of us coming up with different ones and then trying to figure out how that then brings us all together. Because at the end of the day, I think Africa working as a bloc would be extremely powerful. Then we'd truly have a seat at the table and not be seen as a consumer only. Yeah.
Dr. Joy, how do you see, the global policy landscape and regulation of AI and the role for Africa in that? Specifically, also when we're looking at some of the, some big ethical topics like work and AI, the environment, sustainability.
Mm.
What would you like to see here in the future?
I think something that's missing across the globe, across all of the various strategies that have been implemented, is the focus on the environmental impact. And in part, governments generally have an interest in big capital projects, right? So go get land, have a lot of energy involved, and in the past, those sorts of projects had a longer term economic impact. But when we're talking about AI, once that data center is built, how many people are really needed? Meanwhile, that data center is competing with the energy grid and the water resources of people, right? In the book Empire of AI by Karen Howe, when she's talking about data colonialism, she talks about data workers in Kenya, and she also talks about data centers in Chile, right? And how the data that's powering so many of these AI systems, the servers, like it's all physical at some point and it has a true impact. So I think there is actually an opportunity, right, for Africa to lead on that element of it when it comes to the environmental impact of AI systems and how they're developed. What would green AI actually look like? And from an opportunity where you're not necessarily just inheriting what has already been built, but seeing, "Oh, that was a very energy intensive way of doing it, and this is not sustainable. We don't have to follow an unsustainable path." Yeah.
Is that what do you think? What would you want to see here?
I mean, she put it really perfectly. What I the term, or at least the phrase I've been using is, following the irrational path. The rational path dictates that we copy and paste everything that's been done. It's like, okay, you need a big data center to do this and that. But there are ways that we can plug in both the collective intelligence of communities around how they've been doing things differently that could then guide how we do things a little differently so that it's not so energy intensive and not competing with resources in places where those resources are already very scarce. So yeah, I would
Yeah.
agree with that sentiment.
Another space that I think is ripe for innovation, I can see innovation coming from the continent, is around biometric rights and biometric data. So with the EU AI Act in Article 5, if you're getting into it, right, you have specific prohibitions
Yeah.
of AI systems. And one of those restrictions is around the live use of facial recognition technology and why we care about that type of use of facial recognition technology. This is infrastructure for surveillance, mass surveillance. So I always say, once you have the cameras installed, you're literally one line of code away from creating a surveillance state. And the only thing that really stops it is if you have people resisting, if you have laws put in place, if you have real penalties and consequences, right, for violating people's biometric rights. And so that is a space that I think the EU AI Act attempted to address. Yes, you have those prohibited uses, but what often happens, particularly in the later stage, once you've gotten together and you're like, okay, we've got an act, let's enact it before it gets to action. The lobbyists descend, the interests come in, and they're like, that's all reasonable. No one wants AI harm. You want AI, harmful AI? No one's going to agree to harmful AI. So they'll say, we just need to make an exception. So what you'll see in this, in Article 5, if you really get into it, fun reading, you'll see that there's an exception for, oh, we could use um, live recognition if someone's a criminal suspect. Maybe they're suspected of terrorism. And all of that sounds good in theory, but who gets labeled as a criminal suspect in the first place? That actually reminds me of when we were auditing IBM and we saw that, like their peers, this was not unique. They had skin type bias, they had gender bias, and so forth. That there was this journalist news website that was called The Intercept. And so at the same time, IBM was saying, oh, we're going to change this, we're going to do it differently. They were showing that IBM was selling to the New York Police Department computer vision tools powered by AI that could search for people by characteristics, not just skin color, but also if they had a beard or not, right? So then I'm thinking about these scenarios where you're looking for a criminal suspect. Do you even know who it is? It's like, "Oh, it's a bearded man with brown skin." I'm thinking, like, who's going to be pulled up in that case? Other cases, you'll hear that, again, on at face value, it's like, "Oh, that makes sense." Missing children, and children are often used as a shield to get, provisions to weaken and so forth, right? So I'm like, "Oh, things which missing children will be surfaced?" Which will stay missing. And is this actually the best approach? Because here's the other thing. No, everyone wants to be safe in society. We don't want harmful tools. But sometimes when there's the push for in the interest of so-called public safety, that just requires you hand over all your data, right? These are false choices. There are other ways to go about it. And so I would say in a context where you don't have a regional or a block act in place just yet, be very mindful, right, of the exceptions people can poke in when you're just getting to the finish line, right? That we can otherwise pretty powerful protections.
Yeah, and that's where the work of the Algorithmic Justice League comes in, right? Watching what's happening there and then holding people accountable. In the end, it's AI and society and people who make decisions around it, how it's being used.
Mm.
Okay, so I would now go back to creativity and AI to finish us off on a, well, uplifting note. Because I always find it uplifting, Dr. Joy. You have beautiful poetry. You bring
Mm.
it with you to the events we've had with you.
Yes.
And I'd like to hear from both of you how you feel that, creativity and AI can work together,
Mm.
what it can do for us humans
Yeah.
in this time of change.
Yeah.
Wanna go first?
Oh, okay. I was gonna end on a poem, so if you wanted to take it, but you can go after the poem.
I don't mind going after the
Yes,
So, yeah.
it's all good?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I think for me, when I'm thinking about AI and creativity, as the daughter of an artist and a scientist, I've seen how much the tech work I did and have done was so celebrated and elevated, right? Being good at math, being good at science, all things I love, right? Starting hair care tech company, ed tech company, all that part was highly celebrated and elevated. Go to MIT and do the tech degree, Georgia Tech, all of that. When it came to the creative side of the fence, that was like, oh yeah, that's like a nice hobby. That's something you do on the side. That's certainly nothing that's gonna pay the bills. So I found that part. I don't know if it weren't for the fact my mom was an artist and I saw the value of her work, right? And I also saw how it was supported within my household, that element of myself would have been cultivated, and many people have this creative element that isn't necessarily cultivated. And so what I fear with these AI tools, especially the generative AI tools that, play in the creative space, I call it regurgitative AI because it's regurgitating what it took from humans in the first place, will actually, in some cases, dissuade people, from even pursuing some of these creative practices. And for people who don't necessarily know the process of creation, devalue what it means to be an artist because being an artist isn't just about output. And I think when people think of art as an output or just the end product, we really don't look at the process of creation and the value of that, even the collaborators we're with as we're making what it is we're making, and also the story of the creator. So in Unmasking AI, right, the subtitle is around protecting what's human. So I was like, well, what is human? Like, part of it, and you've spoken to this so much with the work that you all do with Ushahidi, is our lived experience, right? And so that's what we're pulling from when we're creating something, to maybe share with ourselves or figure ourselves out or share with the world. I also think about our essence, like our literal physical being, our biometrics, which I think, definitely need to be, protected, as well. And then finally, our expression. We could say the same words, but how I say it and how you say it will resonate differently. If you think of your name, just think of your name right now. Now think of your mother saying your name. Or you all have children. Think of your child saying your name, right? All of that differs even though it's the same name. And so that human subjectivity that we bring to art and to creativity is worth protecting, it's worth safeguarding. And so I think as an artist, as a poet of code, this is part of why I titled myself artist in chief, right, of the Algorithmic Justice League, because I know how much the tech side is celebrated and elevated. And I thought if I were to ever have an organization, we would bring in the art with pride. We would say that there is a place for aesthetics and there's a place for beauty and wrestling, right? Because sometimes what I used to like about tech, it wasn't as messy as humans. Like give me math. I don't want to deal with all these messy human components.
Let's be you guys.
Exactly, straightforward answers.
Me, math doesn't work. My brain.
You know? So I was actually happy to stay away from that, but, art isn't about answers, it's about questions, and I think that needs to, remain. Yeah.
I think you've put it so beautifully that it's about the process and also people coming together and experiencing art together and the emotionality that we sometimes see behind that. So I remember the other day I was watching another documentary with I think 400 people in a theater, and it was a very moving documentary, and half the theater was crying, but together, right? And then they were happy together in some of the moments where happiness was deserved. And it was just so powerful coming out of that. And I found that in itself was also art and
Mm.
being creative together as humans. Yeah. So what about you, Angela?
I mean, just picking off like the common thread in all of those examples you've given is the human side. And so I go back to something that Dr. Melissa mentioned in the panel discussion that we just had, that AI is a means to an end. Like it's not the all encompassing thing. And as long as we keep the human element of it, then we're on the right path, right? So like I think of my brother who is a graphic designer and thinking through his process and how he goes about creating whatever graphics he's developing and how AI plays a role into that. I'm If he were using AI to create everything for him, then we're losing the artistic element, like the thing that he uniquely brings into the conversation, right? But if he's using it to augment or like I don't know, test different things, then that helps to amplify. So as long as we're thinking about how we're maintaining the human elements and thinking about how AI will augment it rather than replace it, then I think we're on the right path.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Joy, would you like to end us with a poem?
Yes, let's end on some humanity, let's end on a little bit of art, so let's see, this one is at the end of the book, and I actually wrote it as I started seeing this rise in the adoption of generative AI tools, and it is called Unstable Desire. You ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, maybe. Unstable Desire. Prompted to competition, where be the guardrails now? Threat in sight will might make right. Hallucinations taken as prophecy, destabilized on a middling journey to outpace, to open chase, to claim supremacy, to reign indefinitely. Haste and paste, control altering deletion. Unstable desire remains undefeated. The fate of AI still uncompleted. Responding with fear, responsible AI beware. Prophets do stare, people still dare to believe our humanity is more than neural nets and transformations of collected muses, more than data and errata, more than transactional diffusions. Are we not transcendent beings bound in transient forms? Can this power be guided with care, augmenting the light alongside economic destitution? Temporary band-aids cannot hold the wind when the task ahead is to transform the atmosphere of innovation. Poet of Code, certified, human made, we're still making art.
So thank you so much for this episode. I am so thrilled to be able to continue our work together with the two of you, with your groups of people, with your collaborators, and to support you in your important mission. Thank you.
Thank you.